Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So you guys read the title of this episode, and I'm sure it needs no introduction about what we are going to talk about, but I'm sure most of you have heard of the phrase No Shave November, or any of the other phrases similar to that, like no something, or I don't know, one of the other no somethings November, or one of the other things where you use like the first letter of the month for something of that month. Like I think it was the self-hosted show, I think, did a Jellyfin January, things like that, where ideally, they start with the same letter. But this month, especially this week, was really the definition of nerdy things November. Granted, it doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue like No Shave November, but I'm going to roll with it, and you will definitely see why. But before we get into all that fun stuff, let's start off with this week's trivia question. So, the Condor Cluster was the nickname of the supercomputer built by the Air Force Research Lab in 2010, made of 1,760 units of what video game console? So, what video game console made up the Condor Cluster? And that is your trivia question for the week. And like I said, we got a lot to get into this week, so let's move right into this week's cybersecurity tip. This week's cybersecurity tip is going out to anyone out there who either owns a domain and or a website, which is don't have active subdomain DNS records that you aren't actively using. So as a quick kind of recap and summary of what all of that mumbo jumbo even means if you're not into the web space. So a domain, you can think of something as your standard website. So apple.com, whitehouse.gov, wikipedia.org, those are all domain names. Now, a subdomain is essentially a prepending dot in front of that. So it'd be something.apple.com, something.whitehouse.gov, etc. So things like store.apple.com would be a subdomain of apple.com, answers.microsoft.com would be a subdomain of microsoft.com, and en.wikipedia.org would be a subdomain of Wikipedia. So that prepending thing kind of tends to be things like discussions, stores, blog, things like that are some fairly common subdomains. Now, subdomain hacking is something that has kind of come up. It's nothing new. It's been around for a bit. But essentially what subdomain hacking is when hackers see that you have a domain that's pointing to something, but there's nothing actually there. So if you try to go to a website and you get like page not found or something like that, that would be kind of an instance where an attacker would see that and try to see if they can't hijack that domain. Now, there's a couple ways that this can be done. I think probably the most common way this is done and how it happens is, say you were hosting a website or something on a cloud hosting service, whether that was Azure, AWS, Linode, DigitalOcean, some other cloud provider or something like that, and you deleted that web page or you deleted your instance or something, but you never updated your DNS records to actually reflect that change, so whatever that subdomain was pointing to is still pointing to an IP address, but that IP address doesn't resolve to anything. So what a hacker would do, or a threat actor would do, is they would do essentially a lookup to try to see where that subdomain is pointing to, what the IP address is, and then try to get a service, a malicious website or something, on that IP address and thus hack your subdomain. So, or not necessarily hack, but hijack, because your subdomain is still pointing to that IP address. So if they can identify that maybe you were using AWS for your cloud hosting, and they can manage to get that same IP address, for instance, they can then host a website that can be whatever they want, and that will be on your subdomain. So it's definitely something you don't want to have happen to you. But the good news is the solution is very simple, because all you have to do is check your DNS records from whoever your domain provider is. So something like GoDaddy, for instance, would be that. Wherever your DNS records are stored for your website where you enter those in, you basically just go into there and check to make sure that any subdomains you have listed are actually pointing to live sites that you host and control. Otherwise, you probably should remove those records so you don't become susceptible to a subdomain hijacking. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, this is Nerdy Things November after all, so let's get right into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I got a question for you guys. How do you spend your Friday evenings? Now, some people stay up until around 3:30, 4 a.m. on a Friday, or I guess technically since it's a.m., that's like Saturday morning. Whatever it is, some people stay up that late because they're out partying and, drinking and partaking in festivities and having a good time. But I stay up till around 3:30, 4 a.m. because I'm busy playing with my brand new Mac Mini. We are not the same, folks. Now, if that is not the definition of what being a nerd is, quite honestly, I don't know what is. So yes, if you listened to last week's episode, I kind of alluded to the fact that this week I would be talking about the Mac Mini that I got. Or actually, technically, going back to Friday nights, if you're talking about this week, this Friday night, I'm actually recording this podcast right now, and it's about I'm not going to say the exact time, but this is around the time where some people would either be in bed already or thinking about going to bed rather soon. And if this was a work day, let's just say I would probably be in bed right now. Now, it is still for what it's worth, it is still technically Friday right now. It's not like that 3 a.m. shenanigans where you're kind of in the gray area of is it Friday night or is it Saturday morning? It is still legitimately Friday. So let's put that out there. But as we will see later in this episode, there is a good reason. Well, I don't know if it's a good reason, but there is a reason why it is so late on a Friday, and I'm recording this when usually I record these episodes on Thursday evenings. But anyway, let's actually get into some of the other nerdy things that I did this week. So starting off with some home lab stuff. So I ended up replacing my R620's CMOS battery. So it had been throwing warnings for off and on for a few months now. The R620 had. It was really noticeable too because it has like this little mini like LCD screen on the front of it. And when it's blue, that means everything's good. But if it kind of has this like orange color, that means there's some kind of warning or error or something. And over the past few months, every now and then, I would see that screen go orange, and the warning was the CMOS battery, I guess power or voltage, one of the two, was low. And I figured I should probably replace it. Well, the first time I saw it, I was like, oh, I should probably replace this. And then it went away, and I was like, okay. And then it didn't come back for a few weeks, actually. And I was like, okay, I guess it's better now. And then over the next few weeks and months, it just kind of kept coming on more and more frequently. The thing that really got it to kick on was whenever I would really suck down the juice on it, aka spin up some kind of AI playground, whether that's like a Stable Diffusion messing around with music generation or a large language model or something like that. That would almost instantly make it go orange and say that the CMOS battery was low and needed to be replaced. And I'm pretty sure that the battery in it was the original battery, so I can't exactly blame it for kicking the bucket after around like 13-ish years or so, after probably nonstop use, because I've owned it for a few years now, and it's been basically on 24/7. And I'm pretty sure before I owned it, it was probably in a data center somewhere, again, running basically 24/7. So it was probably getting essentially nonstop use. So 13 years, I would say, is pretty good. But that was a pretty easy fix. It was kind of nice to get the server. I didn't even have to get it out of the rack, which was the nice thing, because it has the sliding ready rails. So like you can like pull it out of the rack, but you don't have to fully take it out. The rails kind of like support it, so you can pull the server like out of the rack, but it's still like on the rails, if that makes sense. So you can open it up and get into it without actually having to physically take it out of the rack. And it was just kind of fun to get in there and change the battery. And I did, while I was in there, like take some compressed air to kind of blow out the fans a little bit. They weren't really that dusty, but there was a tiny bit of dust. So just taking some time to clean it up. And of course, when I did this, I got a few notifications that my home network was down. Surprise, surprise, since my R620 is the one that currently hosts my VPN server. So yeah, there was not really much of a surprise that I got those notifications. But one other thing that happened this week, which I'm not sure if this is really a nerdy thing per se, but I threw it in here just because it's kind of fits the theme. So this wasn't the Friday night, so there's that. But one evening this week, I made the mistake of checking my email. And that's probably not something you want to be doing when you're trying to get ready for bed and or go to bed, is check your email, because if something happens or something comes up and you see that, of course you're going to want to, look into it, investigate it, maybe respond, etc. But apparently GitHub now has, or maybe they've had, I don't know, but they have a bot that's going around and submitting pull requests for dependency updates, specifically for things with like security vulnerabilities. How do I know this? Well, back in college, so a few years ago, I made the mistake, partly because I was forced to if I wanted to graduate, of taking a web development class. And for this class, the final project was to essentially make a web app in JavaScript. Pretty gross, I know. But one of the requirements for that project was to have it hosted on GitHub. So once I finished it and posted it to my GitHub for the project, I proceeded to forget about its entire existence. And everyone, every now and then, I would see it at like the bottom of my repos, and debate whether or not I should delete it, because I don't really have any. I already have it backed up and archived in like all of my school stuff, so it's not like I need it to be there for like backup purposes. Plus, like, I don't necessarily care about it all that much, for 2, and 3. One thing that I think GitHub is good for is kind of showing off your interests and your passions and kind of displaying, who you are as a developer. And personally, for me, JavaScript just really isn't a good demonstration of how I am as a developer. So yeah, I've toyed with the idea of potentially deleting it, but it's never happened. But then I mentioned I got a flood of emails and how I know that GitHub has a bot. Well, one evening I got a flood of emails, and I mean a flood of them. Like, in total, I ended up getting close to 30 pull requests from this bot from GitHub, and every single one of them sent me an email. Now, granted, they weren't all immediately. They didn't get, submitted all immediately, but there was like at least 10 plus, like 10 to 15 in less than an hour. And then over the subsequent day or so, the remaining like 15-ish or so kind of trickled in. And yeah, it was very annoying. But the irony is, well, I don't know if it's necessarily ironic, but not too long ago, I actually saw a stat that showed up somewhere that I don't even remember what the stat was, but it was like a shockingly large number of like commits or pull requests or something like that on GitHub are made by bots. And this might be the reason. But I mean, props for GitHub, to be honest, for trying to add fixes to outdated dependencies with vulnerabilities to a project that, quite honestly, I kind of forgot even existed. But it was kind of like a hydra, if you will. I think that's the thing from, I think it's Greek mythology. I think, the thing where when you chop off one head, two more grow back, because initially that's what was happening. Because I would merge one of the pull requests from this Dependabot thing, and then like as soon as I would do that, like 5 more would just come in out of nowhere, and it was so annoying because I was like, it's late at this point. I want to go to bed, but you keep spamming my inbox with emails for these pull requests that are just updating dependencies, which kind of makes me think of a couple things. First off, why couldn't it just, update all of them? Now, I get it, like, as far as when it comes to writing code and stuff and doing commits and things, you don't want to have like a pull request that updates like a bajillion things. Like, it's best, when you're making changes like that, to do them incrementally. So I get that. But each pull request had a single commit to it. It wasn't like they stacked a couple commits. Anytime this bot would submit something, it was like a brand new pull request for like one minor thing, and I don't know. Sometimes it like actually packaged a couple into one. It was really weird. I don't really know its thought process. But also, on the other hand, shame on JavaScript for requiring so many dang dependencies with their bloated, security vulnerability-ridden, flaming hot pile of garbage package manager that is NPM. Now, to be honest, this whole ordeal that I went through of having to deal with this Dependabot and these pull requests really got me on the verge of going the nuclear option and nuking the entire repository, because like I mentioned, I don't need it for school anymore, and like I said, I've been kind of thinking about removing it for a while now. So if those pull requests kept coming, that definitely would have been the straw that broke the camel's back. But thankfully, at least for the past couple days, the firestorm has at least calmed down a little bit. I haven't gotten any more pull requests in the past couple days for that project, so I guess the repository lives to live another day, at least for the time being anyway. Now, before we get into some of the Mac Mini stuff, I did want to touch on some video game updates, which, to be honest, I didn't actually update the video game, but I updated kind of pieces around it, and this is where we're going to get into why I am recording this late on a Friday evening. So, do you ever get sucked down the rabbit hole on a project or just in general? When you kind of dive so deep into something, you kind of you stop and think after a while, like, how on earth did I even get here? It's like in the movies where, like, glass breaks, or like you're dropped into this random scene and then like it's a freeze frame, and then it's like something to the effect of, I guess you're probably wondering how I got in this predicament, that kind of a thing when you're going down the rabbit hole. But the thing that's nice about a personal project is sometimes, for me at least, these rabbit holes that I tend to go down tend to be something that really isn't a big deal, let alone a high priority. Yet I'll, just essentially drop everything and just explore this rabbit hole. Because it's not like it's a critical feature that I want to implement, or, some, game-breaking bug or something like that. It's literally just a curiosity that I've had for a while, and then I just out of nowhere kind of get the inspiration or get the drive to go explore this rabbit hole, and then it, in some cases, like this week, basically consumes the entire week. But the thing is, the nice thing about being in charge of my own video game development and me being my own boss is I get to actually explore these rabbit holes to their ultimate depths, for better or maybe even for worse. In contrast, though, like if you're actually in an enterprise environment or writing software professionally, you really never have these kinds of luxuries to really dive into these rabbit holes and explore them to their depths, unless you're doing it like in your personal time. Because when you have deadlines to meet, the software development lifecycle moves on, and you don't exactly have the luxury to explore these rabbit holes, at least not very deep, when you have deadlines to meet, when you have sprints that you have to, complete so many story points, yada, yada, yada. But part of the reason, but I mean, that's, you could argue, is part of the reason why tech debt is such an issue, in the corporate world, because developers don't necessarily have the time to go back and refactor code, or, go down a rabbit hole of how to improve something or things like that, because generally, from the corporate perspective, a code refactor doesn't add any new functionality or fix bugs, and thus is not a high priority and not granted much time, if any. So hence where the term or saying, phrase, however you want to say it, of the temporary solution is the permanent solution kind of gets its name from. Because there's plenty of times where you'll write some code, it works, and you'll say, oh, I'll come back to this later. You might write a to-do statement in there. And then 5 years later, when you're going back through someone is going back through the code base, they see that to do about it needing to be updated, but it's been in the code base so long at this point, and it's been tested and battle hardened in production, that no one actually touches it, and that temporary solution has absolutely become the permanent one. So where am I going with all this? What is this latest rabbit hole that I fell down that basically consumed my entire week? So I decided that I wanted to add a component to my build process to auto-generate Xcode projects for my video game. Now, what did I do to do this? I wrote a Python script. And the keen-eared or keen-eyed among you, those that have been around the C++ world for a while, might be wondering why I didn't choose to use CMake. And that's actually a very easy answer. First off, it's my project. Second off, I'm the boss. And third, I don't want to. So there is your answer. But in all honesty, the kind of the main reason is it would have, if I used the CMake solution, granted, it might have saved me many hours, at least this week anyway. But overall, I don't know if it actually would have saved much time, because I don't currently use CMake for my project. I just use a standard Makefile, like the GNU style Makefile. And that's what my build system is comprised of. So having to rewrite all of that into a CMake file would be a nightmare, and I didn't really feel like rewriting the entire build system just to get Xcode generation support. Now, granted, if I did use CMake, I could also get Visual Studio support amongst other build systems, I think like Ninja or just generic Makefiles, but that wasn't really a high priority to me, partly because my video game as it stands is not built to support the Microsoft Visual C compiler that comes with Visual Studio, for a couple of reasons. One, I just generally tend to prefer the GNU compiler tools, like through MSys2, when doing any kind of development on Windows anyway, since it essentially allows you to write Unix-style makefiles for one thing, and also Unix-style code that will also be able to work on Windows. And when I say Unix-style or Unix code, essentially what that means is how you write code that really interfaces with the operating system on Linux, macOS, and BSD type machines or Unix-based systems. How you write like system type calls or interfacing with the operating system is very different than on Windows. And look no further than native network programming. If you've looked at network programming, like specifically in C, between Windows and Linux or Mac OS, it's kind of gross, at least on the Windows side, in my opinion. In my opinion, the Unix version is a lot cleaner than the dumpster fire that is networking through the Windows API. Now, that's probably just me being biased since I haven't necessarily done a lot of networking through the Windows API, but the little that I have done, I am not a fan. Now, granted, the Unix version is still kind of its own mess, but it's, in my opinion, cleaner than the Windows one. But that's just kind of an example of I could write that Unix code to do networking and compile it through the GNU tools that come with like MSys2, and it would allow me to essentially run and compile this Linux code on a Windows system. Now, is there potentially some overhead going on, using this Linux or Unix kind of code and having it somehow translated? I don't know under the scenes if that's like a one-to-one translation. The compiler literally translates that into native code on Windows through the Windows API, or if there is some other kind of translation layer, if there's overhead. In all honesty, it's probably not as optimized using the GNU suite versus doing a native Windows build with the native Windows APIs. But in all honesty, not having to write code to do the same thing multiple different times in multiple different ways is kind of a net positive, I think. Like, I will take the slight performance hit if there is one. Now, granted, even with that, it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison. Like, there are still some things that you cannot do on a GNU compiler MSys2 type build environment on Windows that you can do on Linux. So there are still some things that you do have to do, like an if-def check to see if you're on Windows in order to write the code appropriately. But generally speaking, a lot of the stuff you can kind of just copy and transfer over one for one. So anyway, with that kind of tangent, I guess, out of the way, so writing a Python script to generate Xcode projects. Now, this is something I kind of wanted to do for a little while. I thought it would be kind of a cool idea. And since I got the new Mac Mini, I figured it'd be cool rather than trying to, download the project that's in source control right now, which this was also part of the reason why I wanted to make this script, so I could completely remove the project from source control. And if I ever wanted to have a Xcode project, I could just generate it on the fly. So that was part of the reason too. But when I was writing this Python script, it was a rabbit hole. And I found there was so when I initially got it working, which granted took a very long time, it worked, but it did not work on Xcode 16. But it worked in Xcode 16 on an Intel machine running through OpenCore Legacy Patcher, but it wouldn't generate a valid Xcode project when running Xcode 16 with Apple Silicon. It would just fail to open. And at first, I was very kind of disheartened by this because I spent all this time trying to get it to work, and the main system that I wanted it to work on, that being my new Mac Mini, it wouldn't work on. But with that said, I did feel a little bit better when I realized the current non-auto-generated one, the one that's been sitting in my Git repo since pretty much this project's inception, didn't work either, and it gave the exact same error message that my auto-generated project generated. So that made me feel at least a little bit better. But to even get to this initial state of being able to generate a valid Xcode project that would have all the right dependencies and all the right build rules and all the right files and folders included, it took quite a bit of spelunking, going through the Python package on GitHub, combing through the source code, just trying to figure out how to use the dang thing. Now, it did have a wiki page, which was semi-helpful. Like, it did have some of the functions, but it didn't have all of them and the exact use case for what all the variables were. So I still had to go spelunking through the source code, trying to hunt down where these functions were in order to actually see what they did, what arguments they took in, and how to use it effectively. Because there was a lot of trial and error of trying to use different function calls that either wouldn't work, or I wasn't passing in the right flags or things like this. And it would range from I wouldn't get any source files in the Xcode project solution, or I would get way too many folders and files that shouldn't even be there, or my linking and the linking of the frameworks and the libraries wouldn't work properly. It was a whole mess, and I was beating my head against the wall for hours on end over the course of a few days. Like I said, this was basically my entire week, just trying to get this working. And the Xcode 16 issue that I kind of discussed with Apple Silicon, first off, I guess I should say, I have no idea why on Intel-based Macs it works fine without any issue, but on Apple Silicon it has a conniption and will just say, no, I don't want to do this. I'm taking my toys and I'm going home. I don't know why, because my understanding is Apple changed essentially how Xcode 16 reads and interacts with your source files in order to be more Git friendly. And what I mean by this is, if you've ever worked with an Xcode project in the past, if you've ever added new source files to your project, you would always have to, when it came to commit, you would be committing the source file you added as well as like one of the files within the Xcode project directory, because it would kind of be adding it to a list of sorts, and it would be kind of giving it a unique identifier. And essentially what was happening is multiple people were adding multiple different files, and because there is this number associated with it, sometimes there would be conflicts, and there was all sorts of like merge conflict issues with the Xcode solution, and kind of importing or adding the Xcode solution to project to a Git repository. So that was one of the reasons why Apple kind of redesigned how Xcode interacted with the source directory. So essentially now if you add files or folders to the directory, it doesn't add them to that solution project. So Xcode doesn't always have to be updating every time, or having to be recommitted to the repo every time you add a new source file or something. So in theory, it was a great solution and makes your life easier. But with how I was creating the Xcode project to support the older versions of Xcode, it completely broke everything, because Xcode was like, oh, look at all of these source files and directories in this folder. I'm going to try to build all of them. And of course, it was not able to build all of them and ran into several issues. Now, it's not the cleanest solution, but I did manage to make a workaround work for Xcode 16 on Apple Silicon. Essentially, what the solution ended up being was I created a subdirectory structure with links back to the folders and the actual files that I needed in order to build the game and, edit the code that I need to, specifically the source and the test directory. There are other directories within the project itself, like the debug memory thing, to do like memory analysis of memory usage, and the asset compiler to compile like the fonts and the images into header files. But those aren't necessarily core to just working on and developing the video game. Those are kind of add-on side projects that kind of build upon or kind of contribute to the game. And plus, I already have the Makefile set up to integrate all of them anyway, so that's kind of my go-to. Really, the main thing I use Xcode for, if I'm being honest, with this video game development is to just have a solid IDE that I can test code and changes quickly and easily without having to deal with running Make all the time. But whenever I want to do like an actual like quote-unquote legit build, I just use the Makefile for that, because I have everything configured the way I want it to. And I could definitely get Xcode there as well, but I haven't put in all that effort to do it. Who knows, maybe that'll be a rabbit hole that I get into down the line. But yeah, so it wasn't necessarily the cleanest solution, but it works for now. Plus, all of the Xcode data is super contained in its own folder, so that's kind of nice, I guess. Now, there is still some work that I want to do, specifically kind of cleaning up the Python script, kind of getting it more, I guess, in line with kind of naming conventions that I kind of set out for myself, because it's kind of a hodgepodge of camel case and snake case type stuff. So it's not necessarily the cleanest. So I definitely want to clean it up a bit. But functionally, it's basically there. But I do have to say, once I managed to run the script and generate a project that was able to build my game successfully without me literally having to do anything, like I literally just double click to open up the Xcode project and hit the run button, and then the code builds and the executable launches and I can interact with it, I was over the moon excited when that happened, because like I said, I was beating my head against the wall for hours and hours over the course of multiple days trying to get older versions and the latest and greatest versions of Xcode to work with this script. And that is why I am recording this episode so late on a Friday evening, because literally this evening up until pretty much, I did eat something before I hit the record button, which granted was a very, very late dinner. But pretty much up until this point, like after I got off work, up until this point, I was just like nonstop trying to work on this to get it to work. So yeah, definitely down the rabbit hole. But I'm happy with where I managed to get it to. I will say that. Now, one thing that kind of tangenting off that, kind of building on that, is once I got all that Xcode stuff kind of sorted, I was, making some local Git changes, of course, keep making some commits, as I kind of went. And when I went to finally push those changes, my CI/CD pipeline broke. And it actually broke a couple of times. The first time it broke was because I didn't update the GitLab CI.yaml file to appropriately account for the new Makefile updates that I did in order to integrate this Xcode project building thing. Because in addition to creating a script to auto-generate an Xcode project, I also updated the Makefile to really clean things up a little bit. Because before you kind of had to install, manually install Python packages so that you would be able to pull down the Raylib source code so then you could then build it. So I decided, and plus for this Xcode project, it uses an additional Python package. So I decided to make everything easier and streamline the entire process, I'm just going to add it as like a rule in the Makefile. So I made a make init rule, I guess. And essentially what that does is it creates an actual environment for Python to run in, so you don't have to install the packages natively on your system, which I think is a huge win. And basically whenever you need to interact with the Python scripts, it basically sources that virtual Python environment, so all those packages are natively there for when it needs them, and then it kind of goes away, if you will, once the scripts are done running. So the init will kind of download and set up that virtual environment for Python, install all the requisite packages, and then it will, through that, then pull down the Raylib source code and compile both the release and the debug version of the library, put those in the requisite spots, so then when you actually go to build your code or you set up your Xcode project and hit run, everything's set up and all ready to go for you, so you can just get down to business. So I think that was a huge win, but because I made those changes, it kind of bricked the CI/CD pipeline, which wasn't a huge deal. I managed to get that resolved fairly easily. But then I ran into another issue where when the pipeline actually succeeded, building, it got to the point where it was deploying my documentation, and that part crashed, which I had never seen that part crash before, and it gave me some weird error that I hadn't seen before, something with the Docker Compose. And I did some quick searching online about what the issue might be, and it seemed like the issue was I was doing Docker dash compose rather than Docker space compose. So really the difference there is the Docker dash compose is like the old kind of legacy version of Docker Compose. So I'm assuming the Docker container that I built was based on the newer version, and the older version of Compose, there was an issue there, which was why it wasn't able to push. That's my leading theory, because I went to my Docker virtual machine where I host not all, but most of my Docker containers, and more or less nuked that thing, because it was not only running the old version, but also had Docker installed through a snap package, which terrible. But this was way back when I was first kind of playing around with Docker. I didn't really know much at that point. So I just, installed Docker through some tutorial somewhere, and yeah, it happened to be a snap package. So that was definitely a mistake. But I actually used my Ansible playbook to install it the correct way, because, I have an Ansible playbook that does that, so why not leverage it? So installed it the right way, and that ended up working, and it got the CI/CD pipeline working again, but it caused another issue. And that other issue was I inadvertently nuked some of my dashboards for Grafana, specifically my one to see kind of all the information about my Proxmox nodes, and as well as my IPMI services. And the IPMI ones really hurt because I spent a ton of time trying to generate that dashboard, because the one for the Proxmox hosts, that was kind of a gut punch, but that wasn't too bad because I found like a template online that I pretty much just pulled in and added my the IP address of my Proxmox host and was pretty much up and going and ready to roll. But the other one, the host's IPMI one that kind of shows me the stats of like my Dell servers and the Xserve and stuff, like fan speed, CPU temperature, all that fun stuff. That one really hurt because that took a long time to configure. So seeing that get kind of nuked made me feel bad. But then I remembered that I take backups of my virtual machine, so I was easily able to restore basically a clone instance of my old Docker virtual machine, was able to recover the dashboards by downloading the JSON files in order to re-import them to the new Docker instance for Grafana, and was able to get everything up and running pretty much right away, aside from that IPMI hosts, because I didn't really configure the database portion of it that well. And as I was kind of going through this whole ordeal, I realized I really need to reconfigure how this works, because it's a kind of a hack job, if I'm being honest. Because while the Prometheus kind of database portion and Grafana are like tied together like two peas in a pod, the other one that the IPMI dashboard gets pulled from comes from InfluxDB, which is its own thing that isn't tied into the Grafana and Prometheus Docker Compose. And yeah, it was kind of a mess. But really, honestly, the main issue ended up being was the UUID number associated in the JSON files. I just had to update that to the new UUID once I got Grafana connected to the InfluxDB database, which I guess saying DB and database is redundant. But thankfully, once I actually figured it out, it was a fairly trivial fix, which was just updating that UUID in the JSON file, and it was ready to go. So that was nice, and I did make sure to back up those other the IPMI kind of dashboard and the Proxmox dashboard, so if something like this happens again, I don't have to scramble trying to resurrect a VM. But on the bright side, I did test my backup in this case, and my backups are working because I pulled the most recent Docker backup that I had, put it back into production, and was able to pull stuff down, and everything was working. So, I mean, I guess, like they say, test your backups, because if you don't test them, it's just wishful thinking. So didn't intend to do that, but ended up doing that anyway. So now let's get into how I spent my last Friday night when I was up till like 3-4 in the morning, that being the Mac Mini. So I already kind of spilled the beans that I got a Mac Mini, and holy guacamole, this thing is not only fast, but just overall amazing. Now, unfortunately, because of this whole Grafana, Docker, CI/CD, and Xcode generating project drama that I've been talking about for I don't know how many minutes now, I didn't really get as much time as I would have liked to really kind of play around with the Mac Mini and kind of benchmark it to see how it compiles code and all that fun stuff that I was hoping to do. Like I said, see the Python script to generate an Xcode project and the whole CI/CD and Docker stuff I just talked about, because that pretty much took up all my free time this week. But with that said, that entire process of, working through that Python script and everything, I was using my new Mac Mini for it. So it's not like I, had it sitting somewhere and I wasn't actually playing with it. I was still using it, just not necessarily testing it and using it for the means that I wanted to necessarily. Because I got sidetracked with other things, which generally tends to happen. Now, one of the first things that I tried with it was iPhone mirroring. So iPhone mirroring was a new feature that Apple announced at WWDC this year, where essentially you can have your phone in your pocket, off to the side, whatever, and you can connect to it with your Mac to, see what's going on the screen and kind of interact with your phone, which honestly I thought it was pretty slick. It was definitely pretty cool. And I am very, very, very glad that I opted to splurge for the 10 gigabit networking option because my goodness, that is amazing. Downloading things from my NAS is lightning fast. And I honestly had so much fun with this. I was literally, like last Friday, literally just slinging files back and forth between the NAS and just watching the activity monitor just to see the full 10 gigabits per second being saturated, fully maxing out the bandwidth, and just seeing a maxed out 10 gig connection was chef's kiss. Seeing that, 100 and like 1.22 gigabytes per second was glorious. And that's not the only thing that's lightning quick on this new Mac Mini, because I also managed to test out the internal drive, which I was getting around like 4,000 to 5,000 megabytes per second read-write speed, which pretty darn fast. And the funny thing is, thanks to the 10 gig connection, that is the slowest connection on the Mac Mini, which I don't necessarily should be a surprise, but even that is significantly faster than the performance of my 2012 Mac Mini's SSD. So I was averaging faster network transfer speeds to my NAS, so a network connection, all of the, kind of overhead that's involved with that, compared to my 2012 Mac Mini. Now, in fairness to the Mac Mini, that's operating off of a SATA SSD, so that's kind of capped. It has like a hard cap. I don't remember what the cap is, but yeah, definitely not nearly as fast as the 10 gig connection. But one thing that I also got was, because I wasn't about to pay Apple for storage, I ended up getting a Thunderbolt 4 enclosure, since Thunderbolt 5 really doesn't exist much yet. But I got a Thunderbolt 4 enclosure and got an NVMe SSD for it. And I'm pretty happy about that, because I got that plugged into the Mac Mini as well, did a speed test on it, and that was basically maxing out the Thunderbolt 4 connection, which was very awesome to see. Which, the side note is, the Thunderbolt 4 enclosure that I have has like a fan in it, I guess, and the funny thing was, that fan was significantly louder than the Mac Mini fan, because quite honestly, I don't think I've heard the Mac Mini's fan once yet. But that Thunderbolt enclosure, like, I could actually hear the fan on that thing, so that was kind of funny. But I kind of already started talking about the specs a little bit, so why don't we just get into the full specs of this mad piece of machinery, this screamer that I got. So I opted to essentially go balls to the wall and got the full-fat M4 Pro with the 14-core CPU, so the 10 performance cores and 4 efficiency with the 20-core GPU, and as such, I got 3 Thunderbolt 5 ports. I technically haven't been able to test those out to their full capacity, since I don't have any Thunderbolt 5 capable devices. Now, I did get a Thunderbolt 5 cable to connect to my Thunderbolt 4 enclosure, but again, it's a Thunderbolt 4 enclosure, so that's going to be the bottleneck. But at some point, I do want to get a Thunderbolt 5 enclosure for that NVMe SSD, because it is, I believe, a Gen 4 SSD that's capable of like 7,000 megabytes a second, like read-write, something like that. So being able to leverage that would be pretty awesome to see. And as I mentioned, I didn't upgrade the storage at all, but I did upgrade the RAM. I didn't max it out at 64. I thought about it, but I didn't end up doing that. I ended up just going for 48 gigs, and like I said, I also got the 10 gig Ethernet upgrade. So I basically went about as ham as you can go, minus the storage, and then of course I didn't end up going with the 64 gigs, but I did definitely consider it. Um, but one of the reasons I went with 48 was my old Mac Pro that I used to use kind of as my main development machine had 48 gigs of RAM in it, and that was definitely enough. Like I was able to have tons of tabs open, multiple web browsers, code open, and different IDEs, and definitely was enough for me. So I think I'll probably be, I think I can manage with only 48 gigs rather than the 64. Now, that being said, the Mac Studio is probably going to be coming out in a few months with fairly similar specs compared to what my Mac Mini has. If the current Mac Studio is anything to go on. So the current Mac Studio, I believe, starts with 32 gigs of RAM and I think a terabyte of storage, although maybe 512, but I'm pretty sure it's a terabyte. And then, of course, it has the Max chip and 10 gig networking standard. So if I were to guess, I would assume the base M4 Max would probably be similar. It'd probably have like a terabyte of storage, probably start at like 32 gigs of RAM, 10 gig networking. So, and then be around $2,000, which was basically what I paid for my Mac Mini. But in fairness, you'd be getting a better CPU for that. Now, maybe it's just me, taking, huffing some copium. But the Mac Mini definitely has, a charm and cuteness factor that the Mac Studio doesn't. And quite honestly, the Mac Mini still packs an insane punch for especially the size that you get. I mean, it's a fraction of the size, yet you still get phenomenal performance out of it. Now, I haven't fully tested and pushed the performance to its limits, but let me just say, when I was testing out that Python script to generate Xcode projects and testing out the init portion of the makefile, I have never seen the Raylib library get compiled that fast. Like it wasn't instantaneous, but it was pretty darn close, which I had never seen that before, and it basically installed all the Python packages basically immediately, which again I had never really seen before. Like I kind of had to do a double take when I ran the init script because I was like, wait, it's done? Like I didn't time it, but I hit run, I hit make init, and then probably like maybe no more, like 5 seconds was probably pushing it, like as far as like an upper end estimate of how long it took, whereas on other machines it's significantly longer. So with that said, of course, I still want to benchmark some other performance metrics with it. Like I want to actually time and get an estimate of how quickly it can actually build my video game project, as well as building the Pokemon Emerald source code, because that was kind of one of the benchmarks I was testing when I was comparing my Mac Pro versus another Apple device that I happen to have in my collection, which, needless to say, helped developers transition to Apple Silicon. Now, one thing I am happy to report is I've had a 3-monitor setup on my desk for the longest time. But this is the first time I've actually been able to utilize all of them for a single computer. Because previously, my Mac Pro, it had support for more than 3 monitors, but I could only use 2 of the monitors because the third monitor I had was the Apple Thunderbolt display, the one that came out in like 2011, I think. And the Mac Pro's graphics card didn't support Thunderbolt, so that monitor didn't work. And then my Mac Mini, the 2012 Mac Mini, only had 2 display outputs, that being Thunderbolt and HDMI, so I couldn't use the third monitor. So, but if I'm being honest though, the Mac Mini, the M4 Pro Mac Mini, kind of looks out of place if I'm being honest, because it's surrounded by 3 27-inch monitors, and this thing is essentially a 5x5 cube. Like, it's kind of hard to say, or kind of hard to believe, but like I have a couple Rubik's cubes on my desk, and the Rubik's cubes are of course they're smaller than the Mac Mini, but like comparatively, they are kind of close in size, which is kind of mind-blowing because a Rubik's Cube is very small and fits in the palm of your hand. So seeing this kind of little computer packing that much punch hooked up to these three huge monitors, it just kind of looks out of place. But I have to say, though, even with that, it does look very good on my desk. But in case you are wondering about my 2012 Mac Mini, because that thing had been kind of my daily driver, if you will, for the past few years, like definitely probably over 4 years at this point, it does have a new home now. It is currently living in my server rack on the rack shelf with my other mini PCs. And currently it's still running macOS Sonoma, but I am thinking of probably downgrading it back to Catalina because that was the last OS version that was natively supported on it, and then just kind of using it as like an Intel like development box, if you will. But getting back to the new Mac Mini, one thing that Apple introduced back in macOS Sonoma and continues into Sequoia is a dynamic kind of video screensavers. Now, the default kind of aerial wallpapers and nature landscapes, they kind of have this dynamic video loop of sorts that they kind of use as a screensaver, which, to be honest, looks really nice. The issue was my Intel Macs, specifically the Mac Mini and my 2015 MacBook Pro, would whenever they would go into the screensaver state, if I had one of these dynamic wallpaper set, they would essentially turn into a jet engine.
It is a screamer.
Which is a shame because I really like how these dynamic wallpapers looked, but at the same time, I didn't want my system being maxed out trying to render it. And the reason why I know it was maxed out was because when I would have Activity Monitor open before like the computer went into this kind of screensaver mode, whenever I would kind of jiggle the mouse or the touchpad or the trackpad to get back into the computer, the usage chart was literally maxed out. Now, I don't know exactly the root cause of what the issue is, but mind you, these were Intel machines that were not supported under the latest Mac OS, but I was running them through OpenCore Legacy Patcher. So that probably had something to do with it. But even with like the post-install like root patches with like the graphics acceleration and everything, they even still screamed, which makes me think that there's something hardware-wise that wasn't playing nicely with these new systems. Like it was all because it was also kind of choppy at times too, so it wasn't like a smooth and seamless effort. Like it wasn't, trying to game on a potato bad, but it also wasn't like a buttery smooth like 120 FPS either. So to me, this kind of screams that there's a lack of hardware acceleration going on here. Now, as a bit of a refresher, hardware acceleration is essentially when a device has a for-purpose thing, like in this case into the CPU, like dedicated silicon on the CPU to handle one task. So this can be things like cryptography-related tasks. So you can think of like the AES instruction set, for instance. That's probably one of the more famous ones, but probably the most famous one out of all of them is like video encoders and decoders. So basically any modern CPU will have native video encoders built into them. So things to handle like H.264 and H.265 encoding, and recently modern CPUs have AV1 encoders built in to the silicon specifically, so the CPU can offload these tasks to dedicated hardware elements to do things much more efficiently, which not only saves you time but also saves on power draw too, because if the CPU can kind of offload this to dedicated hardware accelerated components that are specifically designed to do that one job, the CPU isn't maxing itself out trying to brute force things. So it also makes things a lot faster too, because you have dedicated silicon for it. So it's kind of like back when like cryptocurrency mining was a thing. Like you had like the ASIC miners, which literally their entire job was to mine cryptocurrency, and they were really good at that but couldn't do anything else. That's essentially what, like video encoders are for on a CPU. They're literally just there to encode or decode video, and that's all they do. So the CPU will offload those tasks to it. It will churn through that very fast and efficiently, and so the CPU is freed up to do other things. So another one that's kind of a more recent example is the neural processing unit, or NPUs, which are essentially another example of hardware accelerators on silicon, specifically designed and optimized for things like performing AI or large language model type learning tasks. From my personal experience, whenever I see a system getting maxed out trying to play video, to me, that screams that there's some kind of issue somewhere where the CPU is trying to brute force the encoding or decoding rather than offloading it to some sort of hardware accelerator. So, because generally when your CPU's maxed out trying to do that, unless you have a super powerful CPU, which granted, these older Intel machines from 2012 and 2015 aren't exactly the most performant these days, it gives a very slow and laggy playback experience, and your computer sounds like it's about to take off. Now, I haven't looked into this specifically, but if I had to guess, these videos are probably encoded in something like maybe, I don't know, H.265, which is kind of notorious for bringing CPUs to their knees if they don't have hardware accelerators. But if that wasn't it, there might be some other video codec or something that's required, or some other instruction set that my Macs don't have and don't have the support for, which kind of makes sense because, it's not like these Macs were ever designed to run macOS Sonoma or macOS Sequoia anyway, where these dynamic wallpapers exist. So it's not like Apple, tested on these older machines to see if it would have a good, smooth playback experience. So can't really blame them. But yeah, my kind of takeaway is somewhere there was a task that wasn't being hardware accelerated, and the CPU was trying to brute force that playback. Now, that was quite the tangent there, but the short version is I was never able to enjoy those dynamic screensavers unless I wanted my computer to do its best 747 impression and try to take off. So I basically never used them. Like, I used them initially, and the funny thing is I would have the computer running, and then when I would go downstairs or something, make a cup of coffee, or go for a little walk or something, and when I would come back to the computer with the screensaver on, like, I would be starting to come up the stairs and I would hear this loud fan noise, and I was like, wait a second, that's my Mac Mini. That's not even a server. So my Mac Mini is out competing my server rack right now. Now, granted, the Xserve wasn't running, because if the Xserve was running, that's all you'd hear. But yeah, so these screensavers definitely got the fans screaming. So that's pretty much all I have this week for the Mac Mini. Like I said, I was a little preoccupied trying to get to that script to generate Xcode projects, and then once I got that working, then I kind of went down another rabbit hole of fixing a CI/CD pipeline and getting my Docker virtual machine back up and operational. So didn't have as much time as I would have liked to play around with the Mac Mini, but now that all this is out of the way, I should, unless I find myself down another rabbit hole, should be able to kind of get in some more code compilation tests and really push this Mac Mini. And I'm honestly really excited to see what it can do and how fast it can compile code and kind of compare it to some of the other machines I have. And I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope you are as well. So I definitely plan on testing some of those out. But even though I haven't gotten to fully stretch this Mac Mini's muscle yet, I definitely have been very much enjoying my purchase. So I think that's probably going to about do it for this episode. A lot of nerdy things to cover this week. But before we go, let's get back to our trivia question. So the Condor Cluster was the nickname of the supercomputer built by the Air Force Research Laboratory in 2010, made of 1,760 units of what video game console? So again, what video game console comprised the Condor Cluster supercomputer? If you said the Sony PlayStation 3, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And I think that's going to do it now. So if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And also be sure to share it with a friend or family member. And if you have any questions or ideas or topics about this episode or things for future episodes, you can either leave an email, you can either shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, or if you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.